Talking about Anselm again in this video. Last time, we got pretty excited about Anselm, didn't we? Didn't we get excited? Yeah. Well, this time we're going to get into some of the questions that are left about what exactly Anselm's method shows us about the attributes of God. So let's go through a few of these questions together. Okay, first things first. Anselm is committed to what we've called elsewhere the via negativa, or the apathetic approach to theology. He knows that God is not a being we have conceived of, but that God is greater than can be conceived. But he's also figured out a way to justify our language about God. We can attribute things to God because we know that since God is greater than, anything on the greater than side of the equation could be attributed to God. So I gave you that syllogism that is often taken to mean that Anselm has proven that God exists. Well, if you look closely at what Anselm says, I think it would be more precise to say that Anselm has actually proven that God does not exist. Here's what I mean. Would we think of God as a being, meaning one of the many beings in the universe? Is God a thing in the universe and he's just the greatest, most powerful thing? Well, that's not what Anselm is claiming. And that's not what anything in the early Christian tradition up to his time is trying to say. In fact, they're being extremely careful to say God surpasses all being. God is super essential. He's beyond the concept of existence or a being. But you couldn't draw from that, therefore, since God is not a being or does not have his own essence the way every other thing has essence, you couldn't say, therefore, God does not exist, as if there were no God. But at the same time, you seem to be trapped between saying God does not a being and God does not exist. What Anselm thinks he's actually proven is a negative. He's proven that God must not be non-existent. This is actually true with all of the attributes he gives us. For example, we talked about God's power, which is greater, to be potent or impotent. And obviously, powerful is greater than not power. And in fact, we had to take it to the next level. What's greater than that is being all-powerful, omnipotent. But when Anselm says God is able to do all things, he knows the logical problems you could immediately run into. You've probably heard these kinds of riddles today where people will ask, can God create a rock that's so big that not even God could lift it? Because if he can't make that rock, he seems to be not all powerful. And if he can't lift it after he made it, then he's not all powerful. So see, can't be a God. That's how the logic goes. Well, Anselm's aware of these sorts of things, but he knows that what he has given is not a sort of logical definition so much as a doxological attribute of God. Now here's what that means is we could ask something like this: could God make a four-sided triangle? And the answer would be, well, no, because if you made it four-sided, it'd be a square. But that's not God's weakness. That's not God's problem that we define squares as having four sides and triangles as having three sides. We haven't somehow trapped God in our riddle. God is able to make whatever God wants to make, and he can call it whatever he wants to call it. So is there some logical conundrum we could come up with? Yes, but God transcends our logic. What we really mean when we say God is omnipotent is not that he's able to do every logical impossibility we could think of. Instead, what we mean is an apathetic statement. God is not stoppable. God is so strong, nothing could thwart or impede him. He's able to do whatever he wants to do. You see how that's a negative statement, but we've phrased it as a positive attribute. And you could say this with everything. God is omnipresent, but that really means God is not absent from anywhere. You could go through all of these attributes and see that what Anselm is doing is giving us positive ways to speak of God, to attribute things to God, but he's doing so while protecting that apophatic commitment about the attributes of God. Okay, when we talk about the sort of negative approach or the apophatic attributes, when we say that God is infinite, we mean he's not finite. When he is immortal, he's not mortal. Well, one of the most controversial ones today is the idea of God being first immutable, he cannot change, and then impassible, he cannot suffer. And I say that's controversial because Anselm especially says it in the most extreme way. He says it that God does not feel merciful, but we experience God's mercy. Now, is this a contradiction? No, it's a paradox. But to get into this idea of God being impassible, there's a lot in modern theology, a lot of people who want to say that that's a Greek philosophical idea imported into Christianity, and it's not really what the Bible's depicting of God. And these are fair concerns, but I at least want to hear out what Anselm and the tradition before him has been committed to. Because there's a sort of impulsive reaction that some people could have when you hear this Greek word, apatheia, which we translate as impassible. Because to us, that looks like we're saying God is apathetic, like God doesn't care. But that's not at all how this word was heard in the early church and through the Middle Ages. To say that God is without pathe, without the passions, without the lusts, is the main idea. Because it wouldn't be fair to take that Greek word that sounds like our English word apathetic, like God doesn't care. Apatheia in Greek doesn't imply that any more than the opposite. If we said God's not apatheia, are we going to say that God is pathetic? Well, no, that would be blasphemous. What do we mean by these modern terms versus these ancient terms is where we need to start. I think it'll be helpful to see that even when the ancient Greek philosophers used this idea that God was impassible, they didn't mean the same thing that the early Christian writers meant. The early philosophers would say that God is impassible, and therefore God does not love, God does not care, God does not do anything. But that's not what the early Christians do. The early Christians take this admittedly philosophical term, but they infuse it with the biblical depiction of God. So for the early Christians, God is impassible, and yet God loves. He's impassible, he has no needs, and yet he cares, yet he acts on our behalf. Now, is that a contradiction? No, not for the early church. It's a paradox. I mean, to grossly oversimplify things here, you have a philosophical tradition in Plato where God is pure being. And again, to simplify, you have a philosophical tradition in Aristotle where God is pure act. So for the early church, which is God? Pure being or pure act? The answer is yes. God transcends these categories. So to say that God is apatheia is to really say that he's without the lusts of the flesh, the weaknesses of the flesh. He can't suffer, he can't be harmed, because what would it even mean for God to suffer and harm? If God is the creator of all things, and God transcends all things, was before and still transcends all things, then it's not like you could poke God, you couldn't harm God. And if you go back to our earlier video on the incarnation, we talked about how Jesus has two natures. He has this divine nature that remains immortal, immutable, impassible, and yet he takes on a human nature. So now we do speak of God incarnate and God able to be harmed and suffer and to die. But as God, God has no flesh, he has no weaknesses, he has nothing that can be harmed. He is unconquerable, would be one way to translate this. But that having been said, Anselm takes this to its logical conclusion, and he says, therefore, God has no feelings, no emotions. And you have to remember that for the ancient world, as is true of most psychological studies today, Emotions are a psychosomatic experience. They're bodily experience. And so what would it even mean for God to have these emotions? But now there's a tendency to fear that if God is so transcendent and so infinite, he doesn't even have emotions, well, how could we relate to this God? Well, I'll come back to that, but I first want to make it clear that this idea of God being immutable and impassible and not needing us and not having this sort of pathetic feeling that causes him to act and move, this is bedrock foundation assumption for all the debates about salvation that will come later. Anselm's own text is going to talk about this in our next video, and then when you get to the Protestant Reformation, all the Protestant reformers are assuming this because you don't want to envision God as sort of waiting for his ego to be stroked, as if God sits in heaven, crosses his arms, and he's grumpy until you're somehow good enough to make him feel mercy. No, it's the opposite. God doesn't wait for you to cause him to care and to cause him to love. Even though God doesn't have the sort of human emotions that we experience bodily, yet God chooses to act. He chooses to love. He chooses to care and to do these things anyway, despite the lack of any need in him. Here's one way you could envision it. If you were to go outside on a winter day, on one of those clear days where the sun comes out, and when that sun comes out and the breeze stops for a moment, you look up at the sun, S-U-N, and ask, what does that feel like? And on a cold winter day, that sun feels warm, refreshing, nurturing. But now let's go out to the same spot in the middle of August on one of the heat waves. Go outside and there's not a cloud in the sky, and you look up at the sun, and now you would ask, what does that sun feel like? And suddenly, instead of feeling warm and nurturing, it feels hot and scorching. And then we must ask, did the sun change? Did the sun turn up the temperature? And the answer, of course, is no. The sun didn't change at all in terms of what we're experiencing. What changed was our relationship to the sun. Our Earth on its axis turned closer to the sun or away from the sun, and depending on our posture, we experience the exact same rays and light, sometimes as warm and nurturing, and sometimes as scorching and burning. So it is with God. The argument that Anselm is assuming here is that God's not waiting for us to finally convince God to turn up the heat or to turn up the love or to turn up the care emotion. You never have to. God is eternally showering down grace and mercy and love. And the question is, will we experience that as warmth and nurturing, or will we be in the wrong posture, in the wrong relationship with God, and instead of experiencing that as grace and merciful, we will experience it as wrath and judgment. Well, I think that about does it for Anselm today. I will leave you with this last idea, because Anselm is getting philosophical, he's getting abstract, and there's a risk whenever early writers do this to think of God as so transcendent, so immutable, impassible, that it's almost impossible for us to imagine how to relate to a God like that. Well, have no fear. Anselm knows the answer to that, and the answer, of course, is in Jesus. Anselm is fully committed to the Chalcedonian definition where the Son of God, fully divine, became human, fully human. So if an impassible, immutable, transcendent God seems too far away, too abstract, well, let's turn our attention back on God incarnate. Because that's what Anselm does in the next treatise that we're going to look at. In his Cur Deus Homo, on why God became man, or human, he's going to get into the exact reasons that God, in all grace and all love, came and took on flesh. And he's going to outline for us what exactly God did for us. So I hope you'll come back and watch that video next time. Can you shake? Good boy. Shake. Can you speak? Can you lay down? Roll over. Roll over. Oh, good boy. Last one. Sit. Stay. 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 Oh, no. Oh, good. You got it. Good boy.